Adam lived 930 years. His son Seth, 912. Methuselah reached 969. These are not myths or metaphors. They are listed in Genesis with the same tone used to record taxes and genealogies: cold, factual, precise. Then something broke. By the time you reach Moses, lifespans had collapsed to 120. By King David's time, Psalm 90 declared 70 years the standard. In less than 2,000 years, humans went from living nearly a millennium to barely surviving 7 decades. Every mainstream explanation you have heard, sin, diet, symbolic numbers, leaves one question completely unanswered. Why did it happen in stages? Not all at once, not in a single divine decree. It dropped gradually, generation by generation, like a countdown nobody was supposed to notice, and 3 ancient sources buried across Ethiopia, the Dead Sea, and Mesopotamia tell you exactly what was counting down. What the official record says is simple. God shortened human life as a response to human wickedness. Genesis 6:3 is the standard citation. My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. That verse is treated as the full explanation. But there is a problem with that version. If God issued that decree before the flood, and he did, it appears in the pre-flood narrative, then why did Noah live 950 years after it? Why did Shem, Noah's son, live 600 years? Why did Abraham reach 175? Why did Moses himself, the man who wrote, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10, die at 120? The decree in Genesis 6:3 does not match what actually happens to the lifespans that follow it. Something else was driving the reduction, something that operated on a timeline, not a single command. Hidden inside the book of Jubilees, a text written no later than 150 BC and discovered in full among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, is a completely different explanation, one that names a mechanism, not just a motive. Hidden inside the Book of Giants, also recovered at Qumran, is a record of what that mechanism actually was, and hidden inside the Sumerian king list, a clay tablet now sitting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is the same pattern playing out in a completely different civilization. That source has been buried for over 2,000 years, until now. In the winter of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed Dib threw a stone into a cave near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, near a place called Qumran. He heard pottery break. What he had found inside that cave would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. 972 documents written on parchment and papyrus, some dating back to 408 BC. Among those scrolls was a complete copy of the Book of Jubilees. This is not a fringe document. It was quoted by early church fathers. It was considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the oldest continuously practicing Christian institution on earth, whose Bible contains 81 books compared to the Protestant 66. The Ethiopian canon includes Jubilees as authoritative text, placed alongside Genesis itself. Mainstream Christianity removed it. The Council of Laodicea in 363 AD began the process of narrowing the biblical canon. Jubilees did not survive the cut. The physical scrolls from Qumran are fragile, brown, cracked, some no larger than a postage stamp. The original Jubilees text was written in Hebrew, then translated into Greek, then into Ethiopic Ge'ez, the language in which the complete version survives today. Scholars like R.H. Charles, who published the first full English translation in 1902, describe Jubilees as the key to understanding the early chapters of Genesis. Charles spent years on it. The academic community largely ignored him. The Book of Jubilees does not just retell Genesis. It provides commentary, timelines, and explanations that the Genesis text leaves blank. It operates like an annotated edition, written by someone who had access to a version of events that the final editors of the Hebrew Bible chose not to include. And in chapter 23 of Jubilees, something appears that has almost no parallel in mainstream biblical discussion. It describes the lifespan reduction not as a punishment, but as a contamination process, a biological unwinding, tied directly to specific events involving specific entities, named, dated, located. The Book of Giants connects to this, also found at Qumran. It records the activities of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers described in Genesis 6:4 and expanded in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Giants describes the Nephilim not as supernatural villains, but as a biological class of beings who physically altered the world they walked through. Then there is the Sumerian king list. This clay prism, 20 centimeters tall, was discovered in 1922 at the ancient Sumerian city of Larsa in modern Iraq. It is currently held in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. It lists Sumerian kings before and after a catastrophic flood. Before the flood, kings reigned for 18,600 years, 28,800 years. One king, Enmenluana, reigned for 43,200 years. After the flood, lifespans collapse immediately. Jushur reigns 1,200 years, then 900, then 600. The numbers fall in a pattern almost identical to the Hebrew patriarchs, two completely separate civilizations, the same collapse, the same timeline. The Sumerian scribes left no explanation. The Book of Jubilees did. And inside this source is something that changes everything you thought you knew about why humans stopped living for centuries. Open the Book of Jubilees to chapter 23. Verse 9 reads, "And in the 25th Jubilee Noah began to grow old, and his sons began to degenerate from his ways, and their days began to be fewer on the earth." Read that again. Their days began to be fewer, not were declared fewer, not shortened by decree, began to be fewer. A process, active, ongoing. Verse 11 continues, "For the malignant spirits lead them astray, and they sin and they pollute themselves, and they destroy their lives before their time." This is not metaphor. The writer of Jubilees is describing a mechanism. Spirits, the text uses the word ruach ra, evil spirits, are identified as the direct cause of physical deterioration, not as symbols of sin. As active agents working inside human biology, where did these spirits come from? The Book of Enoch answers this directly. Chapter 15, verses 8 through 10 state, "The giants born on earth, their evil spirits shall come out of their bodies. Because they were born from earthly women, and the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called." The watchers are named in Genesis 6 as sons of God who took human wives. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were hybrid beings. When the Nephilim died, killed in the flood, according to the text, their spirits did not go where human spirits go. They remained unmoored, active. The Book of Giants, recovered from Cave 6 at Qumran, gives us something even more specific. It records the Nephilim leader Mahaway traveling to Enoch to interpret a dream. The dream involves tablets being destroyed, all but a third. Scholars like Lawrence Stuckenbrook, who published the definitive academic study of the Book of Giants in 1997, interpret those tablets as representing the written record of the pre-flood world. 2/3 destroyed, 1/3 surviving. 2/3 of something in human experience was also destroyed. And here is the fact that directly contradicts mainstream understanding. The common assumption is that lifespans in Genesis are symbolic, literary devices used to signal importance. The longer the lifespan, the more significant the figure. That is the dominant academic position held by scholars like John Walton at Wheaton College and widely repeated in seminary education. But that interpretation collapses against one specific detail. Enoch, the most spiritually significant patriarch in Genesis, the man described as walking with God himself, lived only 365 years, the shortest lifespan of any patriarch in that early list. If long life signals spiritual importance, Enoch destroys the pattern completely. The Jubilees explanation actually fits the data better. Lifespan decline is not about spiritual status. It is about proximity and exposure to the contaminating influence. The Ruach Ra released after the Nephilim died. Enoch was taken before the full contamination. He was removed from the process. The numbers after the flood trace a clear trajectory. Noah, 950 years, born before the contamination began. Shem, 600 years, born just before the flood. Arphaxad, 438 years, third generation post-flood. Peleg, 239 years. This is where the drop accelerates. Nahor, 148 years. Abraham, 175 years. 7 generations. Lifespans cut by more than 80%. Something was accumulating, generation by generation. Passed through reproduction itself. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 23, verse 14 states, "And the youth shall grow old quickly, and their achievements shall fail, and in their old age they shall not attain 50 years. It describes a world approaching our world, specifically, measurably. And it ends that section with a question the text itself does not answer, a question about whether this decline was permanent or whether it had an end point. That question connects to something in the mainstream Bible that most readers have walked past without noticing. Open any modern Bible to Psalm 90:10. The verse states, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, 70 years, the number that defines the standard human lifespan in Western culture. Used by insurers, demographers, governments, embedded in modern consciousness. That verse was written by Moses. Moses died at 120 years old. He wrote the standard as 70. He personally exceeded it by 50 years. This is not a contradiction that mainstream theology addresses seriously. It is treated as a poetic expression, not a precise claim. But the Hebrew word used in the psalm is yemi, the actual days of years. Moses was not speaking in generalities. He was recording an observed reality about the people around him. His own exception is the first clue that something more specific was happening than a blanket divine decree. Now go back further to a decision made not by God but by men. In 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his 39th festal letter. This letter is the earliest surviving document that lists the exact 27 books of the New Testament canon that Protestant Christianity uses today. Athanasius drew a hard line. The books on his list were scripture. Everything else was not. The book of Jubilees was not on his list. The book of Enoch was not on his list, neither was the book of Giants. Athanasius did not destroy these texts, he simply refused to authorize them. The effect was the same. Within 2 generations, these books moved from common use to obscurity in the Latin and Greek-speaking Christian world. The Ethiopian church rejected Athanasius's authority. They kept their 81 books. The Jubilees account of lifespan reduction survived in Ge'ez, a language most Western scholars did not read seriously until the 20th century. What your Bible says is that God set a limit of 120 years in Genesis 6:3, and the matter was closed. What the original text actually say is that the limit was not fixed, it was moving, and the mechanism driving it downward was identified, named, and described in detail that the Council of Laodicea and Athanasius's letter together managed to bury for over 1,600 years. But there is a specific name that almost no one connects to this story. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Writing in the 2nd century AD in Roman Palestine, Bar Yochai was one of the 5 surviving students of Rabbi Akiva. He is traditionally credited as the author or primary source of the Zohar, the central text of Jewish mystical tradition, published in Spain by Moses de Leon in 1280 AD. The Zohar, in its section on Genesis called Bereshit, describes the post-flood spirits in language almost identical to Jubilees. It calls them mazikin, harmful spirits, and states explicitly that they affect the physical body, not just the soul. It describes them as increasing in number after the flood because they were no longer housed in physical forms. Bar Yochai had access to traditions that predate the Christian canon decisions. His writing preserves a memory of the Jubilees mechanism that survived even without Jubilees being read. 2 traditions, one rabbinic, one Ethiopian, neither aware of the other, describing the same mechanism in the same terms. This was not independent invention. This was transmission, fragments of an earlier, fuller account surviving in parallel streams because no single council could reach everywhere at once. And here is what changes the interpretation of something in the mainstream Bible completely. Genesis 6:3, the verse cited as God's decree reducing lifespan, uses a word that has been consistently mistranslated in almost every English version since William Tyndale's 1530 translation. The Hebrew word is bishagam, sometimes transliterated as bishagam or bishgam. In most English Bibles it is rendered as "for that he also is flesh," meaning because humans are mortal, they will be limited. But bishagam is more accurately translated as "in their going astray." The emphasis is directional, a movement away from something rather than a static condition of being flesh. The verse is not saying, humans are physical, therefore limited. It is saying, as they move away, the spirit cannot follow, therefore the days reduce. The Jewish Publication Society's 1917 translation gets closer, rendering it, inasmuch as he is but flesh. But even that loses the active direction of the Hebrew. The contamination described in Jubilees, the ruach ra'ah accumulating through generations, maps precisely onto this reading. Humans moving progressively further from the original state, the divine spirit withdrawing proportionally, lifespan dropping as a measurement of that distance, not punishment, not arbitrary decree, a ratio. You were never supposed to connect these texts. They were separated carefully, different canons, different languages, different continents. But the connection sits there, waiting, once you read all three together, and it opens a deeper question. If the reduction was a process tied to increasing contamination, what happens if that contamination reaches its maximum point? The Book of Jubilees, chapter 23, verse 15, answers that question, and the answer is not what you expect. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 23, verse 15 states, "And all these things shall come upon this evil generation that transgresses on the earth, and their places shall be desolate." Verse 26 then shifts direction entirely, "And the children shall begin to study the laws, and they shall return to the right path, and the days shall begin to grow many and increase." Read that carefully. The decline reverses. Jubilees does not describe the 70-year lifespan as a permanent floor. It describes it as a low point in a cycle that goes down and then, under specific conditions, begins to climb back. The text gives specific conditions, a generation that returns to studying the original laws. Laws, not religious ritual. The Hebrew word used in the original is Torah in its broadest sense: instruction, pattern, original design. This is the detail almost no one discussing this topic includes. The lifespan reduction narrative in the Book of Jubilees is not a tragedy. It is a diagnostic, a measurement of how far a civilization has drifted from its original blueprint. Now connect both revelations. Revelation 1 showed that the reduction was not a single decree but a biological process, described in Jubilees as the accumulation of ruach ra, evil spirits, operating through generations after the death of the Nephilim at the flood. Revelation 2 showed that this process was deliberately separated across multiple canons: the Ethiopian Bible, the Qumran scrolls, the Zohar, so that no single reader in the Western tradition could access all three parts simultaneously. The pattern becomes visible only when you read across those walls, and here is the pattern. Every ancient civilization that recorded pre-flood history recorded the same lifespan collapse. Not just the Hebrew texts, not just Sumer. The ancient Indian Mahabharata describes 4 ages: yugas, in which human lifespans decrease from 100,000 years in the first age to 100 years in the current one. The mechanism described increasing a dharma, a drift from original order. The same directional language as Beshagam in Genesis 6:3. 3 civilizations, 3 separate textual traditions. The same structure, the same direction, the same mechanism. This was not borrowing. The distances involved, Mesopotamia, Ethiopia, India, make direct literary borrowing unlikely in the timeframes involved. This is either a universal human memory of a real event, or 3 separate cultures independently arrived at the same metaphysical model of biological decline. Either conclusion is significant. And here is the final completely unexpected fact. Methuselah, the man with the longest recorded lifespan at 969 years, died in the same year as the flood, not after. The same year. The Hebrew chronology in Genesis, when calculated precisely using the ages given at the birth of each son, places Methuselah's death at year 1656 from Adam. The flood begins in year 1656. Most people assume Methuselah died in the flood, that his extended life was a kind of grace period. But the Book of Jubilees, using its own calendar of 49-year jubilees, places Methuselah's death 4 years before the flood. He died just as the conditions that would trigger the flood were fully established. He did not see it. He was, like Enoch, removed before it. His name in Hebrew, Methuselah, means when he dies, it shall be sent. His name was a prophecy embedded in a lifespan. He lived the longest of anyone recorded, and his death was the signal. This matters now because the Jubilees reversal condition, a generation, returning to original pattern and law, is language that describes recovery, not just spiritual reformation. If the decline was biological and generational, the recovery described in chapter 23 is also biological and generational. That is not a theological comfort, it is a design specification, one that was buried across 3 canons on 3 continents, and one that has been sitting in plain text, waiting to be read in the right order. The lifespan reduction from 900 years to 70 was not a single punishment. It was a measured process documented across the Book of Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Sumerian king list, driven by a mechanism that accumulated through generations and was deliberately split across canons that most readers never read together. The people who made those canon decisions, Athanasius in 367 AD, the council at Laodicea in 363 AD, did not hide this by destroying it. They hid it by separation. One question this leaves fully open: if Methuselah's name was a prophecy, and if Enoch's removal before the contamination was deliberate, then the people who came before Noah understood exactly what was happening to human biology, and they chose what to preserve and what to let go. What else did they choose to preserve that we have not yet found? If this made you look at the patriarchs differently, you are not alone. And there is one more layer to this story that has not been told yet. Next week, the Book of Enoch describes a group of watchers who did not fall with the others, who remained in their original role and whose names were recorded in a document that the Ethiopian church sealed in a specific monastery in the Tigray region in 800 AD. That document was photographed once, in 1948, and then the monastery closed to outsiders permanently.